Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. In the small city of Tip City, Ohio, where quiet residential streets sit close to fields and church steeples rise above the treeline, there was a house on Cunningham Court that looked, to anyone driving by, like the picture of an ordinary American family life. Inside lived Ashley Flynn, a 37-year-old elementary school teacher and volleyball coach, a woman whose warmth extended far past her own front door into a classroom full of children and a gym full of teenage athletes who looked up to her. She had graduated in 2010 from Lee University, a Christian college in Tennessee, and had spent time on staff at a local church before settling into public school teaching, coaching young girls in the sport she loved. Those who knew her would later describe her, again and again, as devoted, faithful, and endlessly kind, the kind of mother who filled her daughters' lives with structure and love in equal measure. Her husband, Caleb Flynn, 39, carried a very different kind of public profile. More than a decade earlier, in 2013, he had appeared as a contestant on the 12th season of American Idol, one of thousands of hopefuls who auditioned for a chance at stardom. On camera, he had spoken glowingly about his wife, telling the show's producers, "I absolutely love the Lord. I love my wife more than anything. She is very, very pretty. Just, oof, I love her." He did not advance past the earliest rounds, and his singing career quietly faded, but the footage remained online for years afterward, a strange, almost eerie time capsule of a man declaring devotion to a woman whose life he would later be accused of ending. In the years that followed, Caleb had worked as a music pastor at a local church and later took a corporate sales position with a commercial flooring supplier, settling into a life that on paper looked stable, respectable, even admirable. Together, Caleb and Ashley raised 2 young daughters inside the house on Cunningham Court, a home that neighbors would later remember as unremarkable, quiet, the kind of place where nothing terrible was ever supposed to happen. In the early hours of Monday, February 16, 2026, that illusion of safety shattered. At around 2:30 in the morning, while the 2 young girls slept down the hallway, a call came into emergency dispatch reporting a burglary in progress at the Flynn home. It was Caleb who made the call, and the voice on the recording, later released publicly, was frantic, breathless, pleading. He told the dispatcher that someone had broken into the house, that his wife had been shot, that he did not know whether the intruder was still inside. He described chaos and fear so vivid that, in that first phone call, it painted the unmistakable portrait of a home invasion gone catastrophically wrong. Officers arrived within minutes. What they found inside told a story of unbearable violence. Ashley Flynn had been shot twice in the head while she lay in bed. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Her husband, Caleb, was found in a state of visible anguish, sobbing, struggling to breathe, at one point vomiting from the shock of what had happened. He asking officers in a broken voice, Is she gone, sir, is she?" As though he could not yet accept the answer he already knew. He made phone calls to his own mother and to Ashley's mother that night, repeating the same account to each of them. Someone had broken in, and they had shot Ashley. Upstairs and down the hallway, 2 little girls, unaware of the full horror unfolding in their own home, had woken to a world already changed forever. Police noted physical evidence at first consistent with Caleb's story. A side door leading from the garage into the home stood open, a detail that appeared to support the account of forced entry. Investigators asked Caleb whether there were firearms in the house, and he told them about a shotgun, a pellet gun, and a handgun he said he kept in the center console of his truck. He was taken to the police station that day, where his fingerprints were collected, A routine step, officers explained, since his prints would naturally be found throughout the home during the investigation. Afterward, he was permitted to return home. For a moment, it seemed as though this might simply be an unsolved tragedy, a random and senseless act of violence visited upon a family who had done nothing to deserve it. But almost immediately, small inconsistencies began to surface, the kind of details that trained investigators are taught never to ignore. The signs of forced entry that had initially seemed to confirm a burglary began, under closer examination, to look manufactured rather than genuine. Detectives scrutinized the open garage door, the physical layout of the crime scene, and the discrepancies between what Caleb had reported and what the evidence on the ground actually showed. Word soon spread, through documentaries and local news coverage that would follow months later, of a peculiar detail involving the family's refrigerator, an object whose position, investigators reportedly believed, made Caleb's account of an intruder's path through the house physically implausible. Within 3 days, the picture had shifted dramatically. Investigators had methodically built what they described as probable cause, concluding that Ashley's death had not been the work of a stranger who slipped through an open door, but the result of a violent act carried out by the very man who had called 911 to report it. Tip City Police Chief Greg Adkins, addressing the growing public concern and grief in the community, initially reassured residents that the incident appeared isolated and that there was no broader threat to public safety, a statement made even as detectives quietly worked toward an arrest. By February 17th, the case had grown serious enough that the FBI, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and the Miami County Sheriff's Office had all joined Tip City Police in the investigation, a level of resource and attention rarely seen in a single homicide case in a small Ohio city. On the evening of February 19th, 3 days after Ashley's death, police made their move. Caleb Flynn was arrested and charged with murder, 2 counts of felonious assault, and 2 counts of tampering with evidence. At his arraignment the following Friday morning, held from the Miami County Jail, a judge set his bond at $2 million. Chief Adkins later addressed the community directly, offering both an explanation and a promise. The investigation has revealed probable cause to charge Caleb Flynn with his wife's murder. Specific details of the investigation will not be disclosed at this time due to its ongoing nature, he said, adding that the family and community deserve a thorough, professional, and compassionate investigation into this very sensitive matter. As the days passed, the prosecution's case grew heavier and more specific. Court documents alleged that Caleb had used a 9mm handgun and had deliberately staged the crime scene, arranging physical details of the home in a way designed to lead investigators toward a false conclusion that officers had, in the words of the criminal complaint, been led astray by the staging. It was a chilling allegation, suggesting a level of calculation and premeditation that stood in stark, disturbing contrast to the image of the sobbing, hysterical husband captured on police body cameras just hours after his wife's death. Ashley's family, reeling from grief, began quietly pursuing answers of their own. By early March, they had started seeking financial records connected to the marriage, including details of a life insurance policy that reportedly listed Caleb as the primary beneficiary, a discovery that, if confirmed, would add a cold financial motive to a case that had, until then, seemed rooted purely in domestic conflict. Meanwhile, a no-contact order was placed on Caleb, barring him entirely from any interaction with his 2 daughters, the very children who had been asleep down the hall the night their mother was killed. On March 18th, a grand jury returned an indictment that expanded the case dramatically. Caleb now faced 11 charges in total: 1 count of aggravated murder, 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of felonious assault, 3 counts of tampering with evidence, and 2 counts of intimidating an attorney, victim, or witness. Many of these charges carried additional firearm specifications, formal allegations that he had possessed, displayed, or used a weapon to facilitate the crime. The witness intimidation charges were particularly unsettling, suggesting that in the 3 days between Ashley's death and his arrest, something had occurred, some attempt to influence or silence a witness, serious enough that prosecutors sought a no-contact order in response. Caleb's bond was subsequently raised to $3.5 million, and he pleaded not guilty to all 11 charges at his arraignment the following day. For those who had known Ashley Flynn, the unfolding legal drama was almost secondary to an overwhelming private grief. She had coached volleyball for Tip City schools, mentoring teenage girls through the ordinary triumphs and disappointments of a school sports season, never imagining that her own life would end so violently, so suddenly, inside the home meant to be her family's safest place. Colleagues and former students spoke of a woman whose Christian faith was not simply a label but a daily practice, someone who brought light into a school building and a gymnasium, someone whose absence left a visible, aching gap. Her family, meanwhile, turned their focus toward the 2 young daughters left behind, girls who had lost their mother in the most traumatic way imaginable, and whose father now sat in a jail cell awaiting trial for her murder. Relatives and loved ones, speaking publicly months later, emphasized that their energy was devoted entirely to protecting and supporting these children as they tried to process a loss no child should ever have to carry, made even heavier by the fact that the person accused of causing it was their own father. The broader public, too, found themselves captivated and disturbed by the story, in part because of Caleb's brief brush with television fame over a decade earlier. Commentators and true crime documentarians pointed to the strange dissonance between the earnest young man who had once beamed on national television about loving his wife more than anything, and the accusations he now faced, that he had walked into the room where she slept and shot her, then staged a scene meant to convince the world that a stranger was responsible. The case drew comparisons to a string of similarly disturbing incidents that year, and biographers noted grimly that it marked the second tragedy in less than 12 months connected to the same television singing competition, following the killing of an American Idol music supervisor and her husband the previous July. As is so often true in cases of this gravity, the path toward a courtroom verdict proved long and winding. A preliminary hearing originally scheduled for February 26th was postponed a full month after Caleb's defense attorneys requested additional time to review police reports and laboratory test results. When a pretrial hearing finally convened on March 30th, Judge Janine Pratt set an initial trial date of April 29th, only to see that date slip further still, first to May 4th after prosecutors requested a continuance, and later again after the defense sought more time to secure an expert witness of its own. Throughout these months, defense attorney L. Patrick Mulligan pushed back against the state's case, questioning at various points the thoroughness of the investigation itself, and at one stage filing, then quietly withdrawing, a motion that would have limited public access to court records in the case. Eventually, following a scheduling conference, Judge Pratt ruled that the trial would begin on Thursday, September 17, 2026, and was expected to last roughly 2 weeks, giving Ashley's family, her students, her fellow coaches, and an entire community that had watched this story unfold in real time a date to finally anchor their long wait for answers. More than half a year after that terrible night on Cunningham Court, the questions at the center of this case remain, for the public, formally unresolved, even as prosecutors describe a body of evidence they believe tells a clear and damning story. Ashley Flynn's daughters are growing up without their mother, cared for now by extended family, who have made clear that their entire focus rests on shielding these 2 girls from further pain while the legal process moves, slowly and deliberately, toward its conclusion. Caleb Flynn sits in the Miami County Jail, having pleaded not guilty to every one of the 11 charges against him, awaiting a trial that will ask 12 jurors to decide whether the man who once sang of loving his wife more than anything was, in the end, the person who took her life and then tried, with calculated precision, to convince the world someone else had done it. What remains beyond dispute is the loss itself. A teacher who shaped young minds, a coach who mentored young athletes, and a mother whose 2 daughters will grow up carrying both her memory and the trauma of the night it was taken from them, inside a house that once looked, from the outside, like nothing more than an ordinary home on a quiet Ohio street. Story 2. The neighborhood of Oak Cliff sits just south of downtown Dallas, a place of tree-lined streets, restored bungalows, and the kind of quiet suburban rhythm where neighbors know each other by name and mornings begin with the ordinary sounds of dogs barking and joggers passing on the sidewalk. It was here, in a home they had built their life around, that Jamie Faith and his wife Jennifer lived what looked, from the outside, like a comfortable and happy marriage. Jamie worked as a manager for American Airlines, a stable, respectable career that had allowed the couple to settle into the kind of life many people quietly hope for: a nice house, a shared routine, a dog named Maggie who joined them each morning on their walk through the neighborhood. On the morning of Friday, October 9th, 2020, that routine unfolded exactly as it always did. Jamie and Jennifer stepped out of their front door with Maggie on her leash, beginning what should have been an unremarkable walk through familiar streets. Their home security camera, mounted above the front door, captured the two of them stepping out together, an image that would later become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case, because it showed, just moments later, a masked figure approaching from behind them, closing the distance before either Jamie or Jennifer had any chance to react. What happened next took only seconds, but it shattered the peace of Oak Cliff instantly and permanently. The masked assailant opened fire on Jamie, striking him 7 times, 3 shots to the head, 3 to the chest, and 1 final shot to the groin. Neighbors, jolted from their own morning routines by the sound of gunfire, came running out of their homes toward the source of the commotion, only to find a scene of horror on the quiet street they had lived on for years. Jamie Faith was pronounced dead at the scene, killed in broad daylight, steps from his own front door. Jennifer told responding officers a harrowing account of her own experience during the attack. She said she had been physically restrained during the assault, her wrists bound with duct tape, forced to watch as her husband was gunned down beside her, and left to survive an ordeal that, in her telling, could easily have claimed her life as well. It was a description that, in the earliest hours of the investigation, painted the picture of a random, violent robbery or an inexplicable act of urban crime that had simply chosen the wrong street, the wrong couple on the wrong morning. Detectives, faced with a beloved, seemingly unremarkable airline manager lying dead in front of his home, initially struggled to imagine any motive at all. As one investigator would later put it, Jamie Faith was well liked in every area of his life, leaving detectives to wonder who could possibly have wanted this much-loved family man dead. In the days that followed, Jennifer Faith stepped forward publicly, appearing on local television to plead for help finding her husband's killer, describing her grief and her desperation for answers in front of cameras that broadcast her sorrow to the entire city. A GoFundMe campaign was launched to help the grieving widow with funeral costs and the difficulty of moving forward after such a sudden, violent loss, and the community, moved by her visible anguish, gave generously. To anyone watching from the outside, it appeared to be an unimaginable tragedy visited upon an innocent family, a senseless act of violence that had robbed a devoted husband of his life and left his wife alone to grieve and to raise whatever pieces of their shared future remained. But investigators, even as they offered public sympathy, were quietly building a very different picture behind the scenes. Detective Chris Walton and the broader Dallas Police Department Homicide Unit began working methodically through Jamie's and Jennifer's digital footprints, following the modern trail of evidence that so often survives even the most carefully planned crimes: phone records, text messages, deleted but recoverable data, and financial transactions. As one former Texas Ranger later observed about the case, in the modern era, it has become remarkably difficult to get away with murder because nearly everything leaves some kind of digital trace behind. The first crack in the story appeared where so many criminal plots eventually fail, in a phone that had not been fully cleared of its past. When investigators reviewed Jennifer's cell phone records, they discovered text messages she had apparently forgotten to delete, messages that referenced a man from her past named Darren Lopez, a decorated Army veteran who had once been her high school sweetheart, decades earlier, in a different chapter of her life entirely. The messages revealed something Jennifer had kept carefully hidden throughout her marriage: an emotional affair she had rekindled with Lopez, a connection that had apparently deepened into something far more consequential than either of them may have originally intended. Detectives began to trace Lopez's movements in the days surrounding Jamie's murder, and the picture that emerged was damning. Purchase records, surveillance camera footage, and electronic data showed that Lopez had traveled from his residence in Tennessee all the way to Dallas, Texas, arriving in the vicinity of the Faith's home around the time of the shooting. A car matching this journey was captured on camera near the crime scene. On January 11, 2021, roughly 3 months after Jamie's death, investigators arrested Darren Lopez in Tennessee. When they searched his home and one of his vehicles, they uncovered evidence that connected him directly and unmistakably to the murder. The gun believed to be the weapon used to kill Jamie Faith, credit cards issued in Jennifer Faith's name, and a mask matching the description Jennifer herself had given police of the shooter's disguise. As the investigation deepened, detectives uncovered something far more calculated and disturbing than a simple crime of passion. Buried in the digital records was a trail of fabricated emails, messages Jennifer had written and sent to Darren Lopez while posing as 2 different people, her own husband Jamie and a former co-worker of hers. In these fake messages, Jamie and the invented co-worker described Jennifer as a victim of ongoing physical abuse at her husband's hands, painting a picture of a woman trapped in a dangerous, violent marriage, desperate for rescue. It was, investigators concluded, a calculated act of manipulation, an elaborate campaign designed specifically to provoke Lopez, still carrying feelings for his high school sweetheart after all those years, into believing that killing Jamie Faith was not murder, but an act of protection, a rescue mission for a woman he believed was suffering. Lopez, once apprehended, did not deny his role in the killing, but he offered his own account of how he had come to pull the trigger. He told authorities that Jennifer had directly asked him to help her kill her husband, and that he had driven from Tennessee to Texas specifically to carry out the shooting. He also explained, chillingly, that the final shot fired into Jamie's groin had been a deliberate response to the abuse allegations Jennifer had fed him, an act of punishment inflicted on a man Lopez had been led to believe was a domestic abuser, though no evidence ever substantiated those claims against Jamie himself. Investigators further discovered that after the murder, Jennifer and Lopez had continued working together, coordinating efforts to cover up what had actually happened, even as she publicly grieved and accepted donations from a community that had no idea it was, in effect, funding the aftermath of a plot she herself had orchestrated. Records showed that Jennifer used proceeds from the GoFundMe campaign, money given by sympathetic strangers who believed they were helping a grieving widow, to shower gifts on the very man who had killed her husband. On February 24, 2021, a little over 4 months after Jamie's murder, Jennifer Faith was arrested, initially on a charge of obstruction of justice. It was the first formal acknowledgement by authorities that the grieving widow the public had watched plead for answers on television was, in fact, deeply entangled in the crime itself. 7 months later, in September 2021, the case against her escalated dramatically when she was formally charged with murder for hire, a charge reflecting the full scope of what investigators now believed she had done, not merely covering up a crime after the fact, but actively planning and commissioning her own husband's assassination. On February 7, 2022, Jennifer Faith pleaded guilty to her role in orchestrating Jamie's murder. As part of a negotiated agreement, federal prosecutors agreed to seek a sentence of life in prison rather than pursue the death penalty against her. Prosecutors and investigators who worked the case later described Jennifer in strikingly clear terms, one news report referring to her as a puppet master, a description that captured the calculated, manipulative nature of the plot she had constructed, using a man's genuine, long-buried feelings for her as the mechanism by which she engineered her husband's death. On June 20, 2022, Jennifer Lynn Faith was formally sentenced to life in federal prison for murder for hire in connection with her husband's death, closing one chapter of a case that had, by then, consumed the attention of an entire city. While Jennifer's guilty plea resolved her own criminal culpability, the case against Darren Lopez, the man who had actually pulled the trigger, still had to be tried before a jury. His trial finally began in earnest in July 2023, nearly 3 years after Jamie Faith was killed on his own front walk. Lopez pleaded not guilty to Jamie's murder, even though he had already admitted to law enforcement that he had carried out the shooting. His defense strategy centered not on denying the killing itself, but on reframing his own role within it, arguing that Jennifer had taken deliberate, calculated advantage of him, exploiting a traumatic brain injury he had sustained during his military service to manipulate him into believing he was rescuing a woman from an abusive husband rather than committing a premeditated murder. At trial, testimony focused heavily on the nature of Jennifer's manipulation and the extent to which Lopez could be considered a willing co-conspirator versus a victim of psychological exploitation. Detectives who had worked the investigation testified about how they had traced Lopez's movements to Dallas and the physical evidence recovered from his Tennessee property, while defense attorneys pressed hard on the argument that the entire murder scheme had been designed, built, and driven by Jennifer alone, with Lopez cast as a damaged, easily influenced instrument of her plan rather than an equal architect of it. Prosecutors, in turn, maintained that Lopez had acted with clear intent, driving hundreds of miles with a weapon, waiting for his moment, and firing 7 shots into a man he had never even met, all because of a story a woman from his past had constructed specifically to move him toward violence. What makes the case of Jamie Faith so distinctive within the broader landscape of American crime is the manner in which it was solved. There was no eyewitness confession, no informant tip that cracked the case open, no dramatic breakthrough born of instinct or luck. Instead, the killing was unraveled almost entirely through the quiet, methodical accumulation of digital evidence, unsent or undelete text messages, purchase histories, surveillance camera footage capturing a car crossing state lines, and forensic examination of a phone that a killer's accomplice had simply forgotten still held incriminating conversations from years earlier. It stood as a sobering illustration of how thoroughly modern life leaves behind a trail, and how even a meticulously constructed plot, one built on fabricated identities and calculated emotional manipulation, could not survive the scrutiny of investigators willing to follow that trail wherever it led. Jamie Faith's death left behind more than a criminal case to be solved. It left behind a family and a community who had believed, until the moment detectives revealed otherwise, that they were witnessing the aftermath of a random act of violence against a beloved man, only to discover that the person orchestrating his death had been sleeping beside him every night, accepting condolences and donations from friends and strangers, while secretly having engineered the very tragedy she claimed to be mourning. Jennifer Faith remains in federal prison, serving a life sentence for a plot investigators described as coldly deliberate, built on months of manipulation aimed at a man whose only real crime was still loving a woman who had stopped loving him first. Darren Lopez, meanwhile, has had to answer for pulling the trigger himself, even as questions linger about how much of his role was calculated choice, and how much was the product of a woman skilled enough at deception to convince a decorated veteran that violence was, somehow, an act of protection rather than murder. What began as a quiet morning dog walk in Oak Cliff ended a marriage, ended a life, and exposed a deception so carefully built that it took investigators months of patient digital detective work to see past the grieving widow and recognize, finally, the puppet master standing behind her. Story 3. The rain had not come to Orange, California, in weeks, and the hills above Majeska Canyon lay dry and gold under the May sun, the kind of light that makes Southern California look eternally gentle, even when it is hiding something terrible. It was 2013, and in a modest apartment complex on Rose Avenue, a woman named Maribel Ramos was closer than she had ever been to the life she had spent a decade building for herself. She was 36 years old, and by any measure she had already lived a life of extraordinary discipline. After high school she had worked security at a department store, saving money and watching the years slip by without the future she wanted coming any closer. So she made a decision that would define her. She joined the United States Army, hoping the service would eventually pay for the education that had always felt out of reach. She did not choose an easy path. Maribel served 2 combat tours in Iraq, the kind of experience that leaves permanent marks on a person's nervous system and their understanding of the world, whether or not those marks are visible to the people around them. She came home changed, as soldiers do, but she came home with a plan. She enrolled at California State University, Fullerton, and set her sights on criminal justice, the very field she had once hoped to enter as a young woman working mall security. By the spring of 2013, that dream was almost within reach. She was weeks from graduation. She had scheduled a hair appointment, so she would look her best walking across the stage. She was going to be honored at a Veterans Appreciation event at her university, a small ceremony meant to recognize people exactly like her, people who had served and then come home and quietly kept building. Maribel shared her apartment on Rose Avenue with a man named Kwang Cole KC. Joy, a 54-year-old who had lived with her for about 18 months. On the surface, their arrangement looked like countless others across the country. 2 adults splitting rent to make ends meet in an expensive state. He considered Maribel his best friend. Joy had fallen in love with Maribel, a love that was not returned, and one that curdled, over months of proximity and disappointment, into something far darker than simple friendship. There is a particular kind of tension that builds in a household where one person's affection is not reciprocated and the other person does not fully realize how deep that unrequited feeling runs. Maribel likely saw Joy as exactly what he appeared to be: a roommate, someone to split bills with, someone she had grown used to sharing space with after a year and a half under the same roof. She had no way of knowing that inside that ordinary domestic arrangement, something was quietly building toward a breaking point. There was, however, one warning sign that would only make sense in hindsight. About a week and a half before she vanished, Maribel called 911. On the recording, her voice carries an unmistakable edge of fear. She told the dispatcher she was scared, and that she might have to take drastic measures to protect herself. At the time, this call was a fragment, a single piece of a puzzle no one yet knew existed. It would take investigators weeks to understand what she might have been trying to tell them, and by the time they did, it was already too late to help her. On May 2nd, 2013, the tension inside the Rose Avenue apartment finally broke into the open. Maribel and Joy argued, and the subject, on its surface, was mundane money. Joy had not been paying his share of the rent, and Maribel, understandably frustrated, told him it was time for him to move out. It was the kind of conversation that happens in shared households all the time, an uncomfortable but necessary confrontation about responsibility and boundaries. For most people, it would end with an awkward silence, a lease broken, a roommate moving on with bruised pride. For Joy, it meant something else entirely. Maribel was his life, and the possibility of losing access to her, of being pushed out of the one relationship that mattered most to him, represented an ending he could not accept. That evening, surveillance footage captured Maribel outside her apartment building, alone, dropping off her rent check at the leasing office. It was the last confirmed footage of her alive, somewhere between that ordinary errand and the following morning. When a person like Maribel Ramos disappears, the people who know her best feel it immediately, viscerally, because her absence violates everything they understand about who she is. Maribel had a weekly softball game, and when she failed to show up for it, her family's alarm bells began to ring. She had also missed obligations at school and work, small deviations that meant everything to people who knew how reliable she normally was. Her cousin recalled getting a call from her brother, worried, saying they could not reach her, and she had not shown up where she was supposed to be. Her car, notably, remained parked at the apartment, which only deepened the dread. Wherever Maribel had gone, she had not driven there. Her family reported her missing on May 3rd, 2013. What followed was the kind of grassroots search effort that so many families of the missing are forced to organize themselves, often with more determination than resources. Maribel's sister, Lucy Gonzalez, went on local television and pleaded directly into the camera for anyone with information to come forward. "We have no pieces to the puzzle, we have no leads. Please help me," she said, her voice carrying the particular desperation of someone whose sibling has simply stopped existing in the world as far as anyone can tell. Flyers went up around Orange. Social media posts spread her photo. The family organized an awareness walk at Peters Canyon, hoping visibility alone might shake loose some piece of information. Meanwhile, Casey Joy, the roommate, spoke to reporters as well, presenting himself as bewildered and cooperative. He told a reporter he had lived with Maribel for a year and a half, that her disappearance struck him as strange because she never missed school or work, and that he had already been questioned multiple times by police, given a DNA sample, handed over his cell phone, and even allowed investigators to photograph him unclothed as part of their investigation. "Something is not right," he told a reporter, a statement that, in retrospect, carries an unsettling double meaning. Detectives with the Orange Police Department did what good investigators always do first. They looked at the people closest to the victim, particularly the men in her life. Maribel had been active on the dating site Plenty of Fish, and detectives, led by Detective Joey Ramirez, methodically investigated a boyfriend she had met there, a man named Paul Lopez. Using cell phone records and surveillance footage, investigators were able to establish his whereabouts and clear him as a suspect. Two other men Maribel had met through the same dating site were similarly investigated and eliminated. This is the unglamorous, essential work of real criminal investigation, ruling people out, one alibi at a time, narrowing the field not through dramatic breakthroughs but through patient, careful elimination. As those leads dried up, one person remained who had not been cleared, who in fact seemed to draw more attention the closer investigators looked: the roommate, Casey Joy. Detectives noted something particular about his demeanor. He expressed what the Orange County Register would later describe as concern and ignorance about what might have happened to Maribel, a performance of worry that, to trained investigators, felt subtly off. And then they noticed something else. Joy had started spending an unusual amount of time at the local public library, using the computers available to the public. What happened next is the detail that would make this case. Investigators theorized that if Joy was using library computers for some purpose connected to Maribel's disappearance, watching what he searched for might crack the case wide open. So police obtained a search warrant that allowed them to monitor, in real time, every keystroke and click Joy made on the public computer terminals. It is worth pausing here to consider what this meant in practice. Somewhere in an unremarkable public library in Orange County, investigators sat watching a screen, waiting, hoping that a grieving family's answer might arrive not through a confession or a witness, but through the quiet, almost banal act of a man typing into a search bar. And it worked. Joy searched for information about how long it takes a human body to decay, a query with no innocent explanation for a man whose roommate had vanished without a trace. It was chilling confirmation that Joy knew something about Maribel's fate that he had not shared with a single detective, a single reporter, a single member of her grieving family. Then, on May 16, 2013, came the moment that broke the case open entirely. Maribel's family and community had posted about an upcoming awareness walk, a search effort planned to comb remote areas near Santiago Canyon and Jackson Ranch roads in hopes of finding some trace of her. Joy saw the Facebook post, and while investigators watched his screen, he opened a satellite map, zoomed in with unnerving precision, and focused on a specific tree in a remote canyon location that searchers had not yet reached. It was an area investigators had not previously searched. Police did not wait. They headed to that location before Joy had even left the library. The area police converged on was near Santiago Canyon Road, in the wild, brushy terrain of Majesca Canyon, a place known more for its hiking trails and rustic cabins than for anything sinister. What they found there, after 2 weeks of searching, of flyers, of a family's desperate hope that somewhere Maribel was simply lost, or hiding, or hurt but alive, was Maribel's body, in a shallow grave near where Joy's satellite search had pointed. The scene investigators encountered was not one that offered easy answers. Maribel's remains had deteriorated so severely in the 2 weeks since her disappearance that officials could not immediately determine, from the body alone, whether the remains belonged to a man or a woman. It was dental records, ultimately, that confirmed what everyone already feared. This was Maribel Ramos. Because of the state of decomposition, her exact cause of death could never be conclusively determined by the coroner, a fact that would complicate the prosecution's case even as it deepened the injustice of what had happened to her. The Orange Police Department made the change official the following day. Maribel Ramos's file was reclassified. It was no longer a missing persons case. It was a homicide. That same day, Casey Joy was arrested on suspicion of murder and booked into Orange County Jail, held on $1 million bail. The case that prosecutors brought against Kwang Cole Joy in 2014 was, by its nature, difficult. There was no confession. There was no definitive murder weapon. Because decomposition had erased so much physical evidence, prosecutors could not even tell a jury precisely how Maribel died. What they had instead was a mosaic of circumstantial evidence, each piece unremarkable on its own but devastating in combination. The argument over rent on May 2nd, the surveillance footage placing Maribel alone outside her apartment that night, her total disappearance afterward, Joy's strange behavior with the library computers, his search into the science of bodily decomposition, and finally, the map search that led detectives directly to her grave before he had even logged off. Prosecutors argued that the motive lay not in the surface-level dispute over unpaid rent, but underneath it, in Joy's unreciprocated feelings for his roommate. Losing Maribel, losing the apartment they shared and the daily proximity to the person prosecutors said he loved, was, in their framing, a loss Joy could not tolerate. During closing arguments in July 2014, prosecutors told the jury that Maribel had been Joy's entire world, and that her decision to end their living arrangement represented the end of something he was not willing to let go. The defense, for its part, argued that the state had never proven how Maribel actually died, and that without a determined cause of death, murder could not be established beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a case, in other words, that asked a jury to trust the weight of pattern and circumstance over the certainty of forensic proof. They deliberated, weighing a man's carefully maintained public composure against the quiet, damning trail he had left on a library keyboard. In July 2014, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Not premeditated first-degree murder, but a killing born, the jury seemed to conclude, from a moment of rage and loss of control rather than a calculated plan, a legal distinction that mattered enormously to how the case would be remembered, even as it changed little for the family left behind. In September 2014, Kwang Cole Joy stood before a judge in Santa Ana to be sentenced. He was given 15 years to life in state prison. Even at his sentencing, reports noted, Joy continued to insist on his deep feelings for Maribel, telling the court that he had cared for her more than anyone. It was a strange, uncomfortable echo of the same devotion prosecutors said had driven him to kill her in the first place. A reminder that the emotional core of this case was never simple obsession in a cartoonish sense, but something more human and more disturbing. The conviction, apparently sincere, that loving someone entitled him to keep her, even after she had made clear she no longer wanted him in her life. For Maribel's family, the sentencing offered a form of closure, but not peace. A woman who had survived 2 combat tours in Iraq, who had spent years working toward a college degree specifically so she could build a career protecting others, was killed not on a battlefield, but inside the very apartment she called home, by someone she had trusted enough to live beside for a year and a half. She never got to walk across that graduation stage. She never got to be honored at the veterans ceremony her school had planned. She never got to use the criminal justice degree she had worked so hard to earn. More than a decade later, Maribel Ramos's case continues to draw attention, not because of graphic violence, but because of the unusual method that cracked it open. because of how investigators used real-time monitoring of a public library computer to catch a killer in the act of covering his tracks. The image lingers precisely because it is so ordinary and so chilling at once. A man sitting at a public library terminal, believing himself unwatched, quietly searching for the answers a guilty conscience needs, while unseen investigators traced every click back to the truth. Maribel Ramos's as the person she actually was. A soldier, a student, a sister, a friend on the softball field. A woman who had already survived war, and was simply trying to build a life afterward when that life was taken from her by someone she never suspected wanted to take it. Story 4. The morning of June 13, 2001, arrived in Omaha, Nebraska, the way most Wednesday mornings did in the Benson neighborhood. Unremarkable, ordinary, the kind of day that leaves almost nothing behind in a person's memory unless something forces it to. Lawns were being mowed. Trash cans sat at curbs, waiting to be brought back in. And inside a modest house on 48th and Pinckney Street, a 19-year-old named Jason Anthony Jalkowski was getting ready for a shift at work that he had not originally expected to have that day. Jason was, by every account that survives him, a quiet young man. His mother, Kelly, described him simply as shy, a boy with a small handful of friends. The kind of description that carries no drama in it at all, only tenderness. He had been born on June 24, 1981, in Grand Island, Nebraska, and by 2001 he was a few weeks shy of his 20th birthday, living at home with his parents in the house where he had grown comfortable, the house that still had his younger brother in it, still had the ordinary rhythms of a family that had no idea their world was about to be permanently altered. Jason was piecing together a future for himself in the deliberate, patient way that many 19-year-olds do. He was enrolled part-time in the radio broadcasting program at Iowa Western Community College, just across the river in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and he had his sights set on a specific, almost boyishly hopeful dream: to become a DJ for the local station KIWR. In the meantime, he worked at a Fazoli's restaurant on 80th and Cass Street, one of those Italian fast food chains that dotted American strip malls in the early 2000s, the kind of job that pays the bills while a bigger plan quietly takes shape in the background. That Wednesday, Jason's routine was interrupted by something small. His manager called him in early. It should have been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, the kind of last-minute schedule change that happens to service workers everywhere. But there was a complication. Jason's car was in the shop for repairs, so he had no way to drive himself to the restaurant, which sat more than 4 miles from his house. His first instinct was simply to walk the whole distance, an ambitious but plausible plan for a determined 19-year-old on a summer morning. But then a co-worker offered him a ride instead, which solved the distance problem but created a smaller, oddly consequential one. Jason had never been particularly good at giving directions, and rather than try to explain how to find his house, he suggested they meet somewhere both of them already knew. They settled on Benson High School, the school Jason and his co-worker had both once attended, a familiar landmark that sat only 8 blocks, roughly half a mile, from his front door. It was a reasonable, sensible plan. Walk a short distance, meet a friend, get a ride to work. Nothing about it suggested danger. Nothing about it suggested that this brief, mundane errand would become the last verifiable act of Jason Jalkowski's life. Before he left the house, Jason paused to help his younger brother with an ordinary chore, pulling the trash cans back from the curb where they had been left for pickup. It is a detail almost too small to matter, the kind of fleeting domestic moment that fills thousands of ordinary mornings and is normally forgotten within the hour. But a neighbor happened to see it, and that unremarkable act of brotherly help would become, by grim necessity, the very last confirmed sighting of Jason Jalkowski, alive anywhere, that anyone has ever been able to establish. The time was 10:45 a.m. He was dressed in a way that, in retrospect, feels almost achingly specific, almost too detailed for how little else about that day would ever be known. He wore a white Chicago Cubs t-shirt, quite possibly one featuring the slugger Sammy Sosa, along with black dress pants and black dress shoes, an outfit that suggests he intended to change once he arrived at the restaurant, since he was also carrying his red Fazoli's work shirt with him, folded or slung over an arm, ready for the shift ahead. He wore a blue Cubs cap. He set out walking toward Benson High School, toward the friend who was going to give him a ride, toward a job that would have paid him for a few hours of his time, and then let him go home again, the same as it had 100 times before. He never got there. Here is the detail that makes Jason Jalkowski's disappearance almost uniquely disturbing among missing persons cases. The walk from his house to Benson High School was 8 blocks. Half a mile. A walk that, at an ordinary pace, takes perhaps 10 to 15 minutes to complete through a residential neighborhood in broad daylight on a Wednesday morning when people were out mowing lawns and tending to their own routines. It was not a walk through an isolated forest or an abandoned industrial lot. It was a walk through the middle of a lived-in American neighborhood, past houses where families were awake and moving around under the ordinary summer sun of a Nebraska June. And somewhere along those 8 blocks, Jason Jalkowski simply stopped existing, as far as any human witness, camera, or piece of physical evidence has ever been able to establish. Less than an hour after the neighbor saw him with the trash cans, between 11:15 and 11:30 that same morning, Jason's co-worker called his house. She had been waiting for him at Benson High School, exactly as they had planned, and he had never shown up. It was a small, ordinary irritation at first, the kind of missed connection that happens between friends and co-workers constantly, usually resolved within minutes by a phone call or a shrug and a guess he forgot. But this time, no explanation ever arrived. Jason did not call. He did not show up late, breathless and apologetic. He simply was not there. And then, as the hours stretched into afternoon and the afternoon stretched into evening, it became clear to everyone who loved him that something had gone terribly wrong. Police and Jason's family did something that should have been decisive. They checked the security cameras at Benson High School, hoping for footage of him arriving, walking past, anything that might show where his path had taken him. But the cameras showed nothing. Jason never appeared on any of them. He had not simply arrived late or wandered off after reaching the school. According to every camera positioned to capture that stretch of ground, he had never arrived at all. Whatever happened to him happened somewhere within those 8 blocks, in the open air of a residential neighborhood, without a single lens catching so much as a glimpse of him. What makes an investigation possible in most missing person cases is friction. A struggle leaves marks. A car leaves tire tracks or a description witnesses can recall. A phone leaves a trail of towers it pinged. A wallet, a jacket, a shoe left behind in a scuffle gives investigators something physical to hold on to, a thread to pull. Jason Jalkowski's case offered investigators none of that. No witness came forward describing a struggle, a raised voice, an unfamiliar car idling too long at a curb. Nothing about the scene, in the days and weeks that followed, appeared out of place. And the disappearance had unfolded not under cover of darkness, but in the middle of a bright June day, when dozens of people should have been in a position to see something, anything unusual. A veteran police officer working the case would later describe it as the most baffling case he had encountered in 30 years of law enforcement, a statement that carries enormous weight coming from someone who had presumably worked through decades of Omaha's other tragedies and mysteries. It is one thing for a case to be difficult. It is another thing entirely for an experienced investigator, someone who has seen the patterns criminals repeat and the mistakes witnesses make, to look at a case and find no pattern at all, no thread to follow, nothing but a half-mile of empty sidewalk between a young man's front door and his intended destination. Jason's mother, Kelly Jalkowski, has spent more than 2 decades now living inside that absence of information, and the language she and other family members have used over the years to describe the case reflects just how total the uncertainty has remained. There is no confirmed timeline of what happened after 10:45 a.m. There is no physical evidence connecting to a suspect, a vehicle, or a location. There is not even certainty about whether Jason left the neighborhood on foot, was forced into a vehicle, or met some other fate entirely within those 8 blocks. Range from abduction by a stranger to the grim possibility of a hit-and-run accident in which a panicked driver removed his body from the scene rather than report what had happened. None of these theories has ever been substantiated by evidence strong enough to bring the case to a close. They remain exactly what they have always been, possibilities, floated into a vacuum where facts refuse to arrive. Grief, when it has no resolution, no funeral, no answer, does not behave the way grief is supposed to behave. There is no fixed point to grieve toward, no grave to visit, no verdict to close a chapter. For Jason's parents, the absence of their son became not an ending but an open wound that stretched across years, then decades, refusing to heal because it was never allowed the basic closure that even the most devastating deaths usually provide. Rather than allow that unresolved grief to consume them privately, Jason's parents made a decision that would ultimately touch thousands of other families they would never personally meet. They founded an organization called Project Jason, built specifically to support the families of other missing persons, people who were now living through the exact same agonizing uncertainty that had swallowed their own lives since that June morning in 2001. It is one of the more remarkable transformations to emerge from an American missing persons case. A family with no answers of their own, choosing to spend their years helping strangers search for answers about their missing loved ones, understanding intimately from the inside exactly what that search demands and exactly what it costs. Their advocacy did not stop with a support organization. Kelly and her husband lobbied the Nebraska legislature directly, arguing that the system meant to track and report missing persons across the state was inadequate, too fragmented, too slow to help families like theirs in the critical early hours and days when information matters most. In 2005, that lobbying produced a tangible result: the passage of Jason's Law, legislation creating a statewide database intended to improve how missing persons cases were reported and tracked across Nebraska. It was named for their son, a permanent legislative marker bearing his name, ensuring that even without a resolution to his own case, Jason Jalkowski's disappearance would leave behind a structure meant to help other families find their own answers faster than his family ever could. Kelly Jalkowski's advocacy work did not go unnoticed at the national level. In 2010, she received the Volunteer for Victims Award directly from the United States Attorney General Eric Holder, a recognition of the sustained, difficult work of supporting missing persons families through Project Jason. For years later, in 2014, the state of Nebraska honored her with the Governor's Points of Light Award, another formal acknowledgement of a mother who had turned an unanswerable tragedy into decades of service for others facing the same darkness. There is a psychological toll that accompanies missing persons cases that never reach a conclusion, one that grief researchers and family advocates have long recognized as different from, and in some ways heavier than, the grief that follows a confirmed death. When someone dies, however tragically, the people left behind eventually move through stages toward some form of acceptance, aided by rituals, by evidence, by the simple biological and social permission to grieve a completed loss. When someone disappears without any resolution, that permission never fully arrives. Every year that passes without answers is a year spent oscillating between hope and despair, between imagining a joyful reunion and imagining the worst possible outcome, without ever settling into either. Jason's case has now stretched past 2 decades, and in that time it has become something larger than a single family's tragedy. It has been discussed on true crime podcasts, analyzed by online communities dedicated to unsolved mysteries, and periodically revisited by local Omaha news outlets marking grim anniversaries. 10 years missing, 16 years missing, 20 years missing, and now, in 2026, 25 years since a 19-year-old walked out his front door on an ordinary Wednesday morning and never came home. Each retelling adds no new physical evidence, no breakthrough witness, no forensic discovery. What each retelling does add, however, is a renewed circulation of Jason's photograph, his description, and the case details, keeping alive the small but real possibility that someone, somewhere, might recognize a detail they had previously dismissed, or finally feel moved to come forward with information they have carried in silence for years. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children continues to list Jason's case, complete with an age-progressed photograph estimating what he might look like now, decades after the teenager in the Cubs cap vanished. A haunting visual reminder that somewhere in that progression from 19 to a middle-aged man exists an entire unlived life, one his family has never stopped hoping might still be out there to reclaim. The FBI, too, continues to list Jason Jalkowski among its missing persons cases, and the Omaha Police Department has stated publicly that the investigation remains active, that detectives have not closed the file on the most baffling case one of their own veteran officers had ever encountered. What makes Jason Jalkowski's disappearance so difficult to sit with is precisely the absence of the narrative structures that usually give crime stories their shape. There is no arrest to build toward, no trial to provide catharsis, no confession that finally explains the unexplainable. There is only a 19-year-old boy who liked the Chicago Cubs, who was quietly working toward becoming a radio DJ, who paused to help his little brother with the trash cans on his way out the door, and who then walked directly into a half-mile of silence from which no verified trace of him has ever emerged. His mother's decades of advocacy work through Project Jason and Jason's Law stand as the most tangible legacy to emerge from his disappearance. Proof that even an unanswered tragedy can be transformed into something that protects other families from experiencing the same isolating confusion in the crucial early hours of a loved one's disappearance. But for Jason himself, the story remains exactly where it stood on the afternoon of June 13, 2001, when his co-worker first called his house to ask why he had never arrived, unfinished, unresolved, and quietly, persistently waiting for an answer that, 25 years later, still has not come. Story 5. The autumn afternoon of Friday, October 14, 2022, unfolded like countless other school days in the 19th arrondissement of Paris, a diverse neighborhood in northeastern Paris where working families lived in apartment buildings that lined streets busy with the ordinary rhythms of urban life. 12-year-old Lola Daviette finished her classes and began the short journey home, walking the familiar route she had traveled hundreds of times before, her backpack slung over her shoulder, her mind perhaps occupied with weekend plans or thoughts of the homework that awaited. She was a bright, cheerful child, the daughter of Johann and Delphine Daviette, who worked as caretakers for the apartment building where the family lived, managing the property and ensuring everything functioned smoothly for the residents. Lola had 2 brothers, Jordan and Thibaut, and the family had built their life in this building, their home intertwined with their work in the way that defines so many working-class families in Paris. At approximately 3:15 that afternoon, security cameras captured Lola arriving at the entrance of her building on Rue de Haute-Paul, a young girl returning home from school. But the video also captured something else, something that would prove to be the beginning of an unthinkable tragedy. Lola was approached by a woman near the building's entrance, someone who engaged her in conversation before they entered the building together. The woman was later identified as 24-year-old Dabia Benkerd, an Algerian national who had been staying intermittently with her older sister, Friha, in an apartment she was subletting in the same building. Hours passed, and Lola did not come home. For parents, especially those whose children follow predictable routines, the failure of a child to arrive home on time triggers a cascade of emotions. First confusion, then concern, then rapidly escalating fear as minutes ticked by without explanation. By 4:30 in the afternoon, Johann and Delphine knew something was wrong. Lola was responsible and reliable, not the type to deviate from her routine without telling anyone. Johann went to the local police station to report his daughter missing, his voice urgent with the fear that any parent would feel in such circumstances. As the caretaker of the building, Johann had access to something that many parents in similar situations do not: comprehensive security camera footage that covered the building's entrances and common areas. He immediately reviewed the recordings, searching for any sign of his daughter, any clue that might explain where she had gone. What he saw on those screens sent his fear into overdrive. There was Lola, arriving home from school just as she should have, but then following a woman, someone Johann didn't recognize, into the building. Who was this woman? Why had Lola gone with her? Where were they now? At 6:45 that evening, as the October darkness descended over Paris, Delphine made a desperate plea on Facebook. Alert: abduction of our daughter, Lola, seen last time at 3:20 in the company of a girl that we don't know in our residence. It was the kind of post that makes everyone who reads it stop breathing for a moment. The kind of message that transforms a stranger's tragedy into a collective nightmare as people imagine themselves in those parents' position, helpless and terrified. The police responded immediately, treating the case with the urgency it deserved. Officers arrived at the building and reviewed the same security footage that Johann had watched, noting the timestamp and the woman's appearance, beginning the process of identifying who she was and where she might have taken Lola. But even as they worked to generate leads and organize a search, events were unfolding that would render their rescue efforts tragically futile. Later that same evening, at approximately 5 o'clock, additional security footage captured Dabia Benkert leaving the building alone, struggling with heavy luggage, a large plastic trunk that she could barely maneuver through the doorway. A neighbor, seeing her difficulty, helpfully held the door open for her, an act of casual kindness that would later haunt that person when they learned what was inside that container. Witnesses reported seeing Benkert carrying the trunk to a nearby restaurant before returning to the apartment complex, where she abandoned the container in the building's courtyard. A homeless man discovered the trunk and, curiosity overcoming caution, opened it. What he found inside sent him running to find police. Inside that plastic container was the body of Lola Daviet, the 12-year-old girl who had walked into her building just hours earlier, who should have been safe in her own home, had been murdered in the most brutal fashion imaginable. The details of what had been done to her were so horrific that they shocked even experienced investigators who had seen countless crime scenes. According to the subsequent investigation and forensic examination, Lola had been lured into the apartment where Benkert was staying. What happened in that apartment over the next hour and a half represented evil in its purest form. Lola had been subjected to terrible violence, restrained and attacked with scissors and a box cutter. She had been bound with duct tape, including over her face, and had ultimately died from asphyxiation. And in a detail that investigators could never fully explain, the numbers 1 and 0 had been written on her feet. The autopsy revealed evidence of assault and showed that the child had suffered greatly before death finally released her from her torment. The investigation moved swiftly once Lola's body was discovered. The security footage provided a clear timeline and identification of the suspect, and within 24 hours of Lola's body being found, police arrested Dabia Benkert. She confessed to killing Lola, though the motivation she offered, if it could even be called that, made little sense to anyone who heard it. Defense attorneys would later suggest that Benkert may have been seeking revenge against Lola's family because they had declined to provide her with a key to the building, a trivial grievance that bore no rational connection to the magnitude of violence she had inflicted. As the details of the case emerged, France was gripped by horror and outrage. The murder of any child is a crime that shakes the foundations of a society, but the particular cruelty of what had been done to Lola, combined with the randomness of her selection as a victim, created a sense of vulnerability that rippled through every parent in the nation. The case also became politicized in ways that Lola's family explicitly tried to prevent. Dabia Benkert was in France illegally at the time of the murder. She had overstayed her student visa and had been ordered to leave the country months earlier after being stopped at a Paris airport in July 2022. Right-wing and far-right politicians seized on this fact, using Lola's death to advocate for stricter immigration policies and deportation measures. But for Johann and Delphine Daviet, the political debates were a painful distraction from their grief. Their attorney made clear that the family called on politicians not to exploit Lola's photograph for political ends. They wanted their daughter remembered as a person, not as a symbol in someone else's political campaign. They wanted justice, yes, but more than that, They wanted their daughter back, and no verdict or policy change could give them that. The impact of Lola's murder on her father was devastating beyond measure. Johann Daviet, who had been sober for years, began drinking the day his daughter's body was found and never stopped. He drank from morning until night. Delphine would later testify in court, her voice carrying the weight of losing both a daughter and a husband to the same act of violence. The grief consumed him, eating away at his health, his relationships, his ability to function. He and Delphine separated, unable to hold their marriage together under the crushing weight of their shared trauma. Johann lost his job, lost his home, lost everything that had defined his life before that terrible October day. On February 23, 2024, just 16 months after Lola's murder, Johann Daviet died in Fouquerville at the age of 49. The official cause was health complications, but everyone who knew the family understood the truth. Johann had died of a broken heart, of grief so profound that his body simply could not sustain it. Dabia Benkert had not just murdered Lola, she had effectively killed both father and daughter. The trial of Dabia Benkert began on Friday, October 17, 2025, nearly 3 years after Lola's murder. It was a high-profile case that drew intense media attention, with the courtroom packed with journalists, members of the public, and most importantly, Lola's family. Delphine Daviet attended, along with her son, Lola's brother, both of them bearing witness to the judicial proceedings that would determine Benkert's fate. Johann's absence was felt acutely, a ghost at the trial, another victim unable to see justice served. The prosecution presented the security footage, the forensic evidence, and the testimony of investigators who had worked the case. The jury saw images of Lola's mutilated body, photographs that no one should ever have to see, visual documentation of cruelty that defied comprehension. Delphine Daviet asked a forensic expert whether her daughter had suffered, needing to know even though the answer would bring no comfort. The expert confirmed what Delphine already knew in her heart. She undoubtedly suffered. In her own address to the court, Delphine referred to Benkert as this thing, this monster, struggling to find words adequate to describe the person who had destroyed her family. She asked the question that had haunted her since the day Lola died. Why did Lola follow her? It was the kind of question parents ask themselves in the aftermath of tragedy, replaying every decision, wondering what they could have done differently, what warning signs they might have missed. But the truth was that Lola had done nothing wrong. She was a trusting child who encountered someone evil, and no amount of parental vigilance or safety lessons could have prevented what happened in those moments when predator and prey crossed paths. Psychiatric experts testified that Benkert exhibited psychopathic traits, but was legally sane and fully responsible for her actions. The prosecutor made clear in his arguments that no drug treatment can fundamentally change Ms. Benkert's personality. There is no illness, there is no treatment. She was not mentally ill in a way that diminished her culpability. She was simply someone capable of extraordinary evil, someone whose personality was fundamentally broken in ways that made her dangerous to everyone around her. When Benkert herself addressed the court, her statement was brief and inadequate. I ask for forgiveness, and what I did is horrible. That's all I have to say. The words rang hollow, a perfunctory acknowledgement of guilt that could never approach genuine remorse or understanding of the magnitude of what she had done. On October 24, 2025, after a week-long trial, the judges and jury delivered their verdict. Guilty on all charges of rape, torture, and murder. The sentence was the harshest available under French law. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, with a minimum of 30 years that must be served before any consideration of release. This sentence, known in France as exceedingly rare, reserved for only the most heinous crimes. Since the sentence was introduced into French law in 1994, only 4 other criminals had received it, and all of them were men. Dabia Benkert became the first woman in France to be sentenced to real-life imprisonment. In explaining the sentence, the presiding judge noted the extreme cruelty of the criminal acts, which he characterized as true torture. He further explained that the court had taken into account the unspeakable psychological damage inflicted on the victim and her family in violent and unimaginable circumstances. It was an acknowledgement that the crime had ripples extending far beyond Lola herself, that it had destroyed a family and traumatized a nation. The case of Lola Daviet stands as a reminder that evil exists in the world, that monsters sometimes wear human faces and live in ordinary apartment buildings where children should be safe. It is a testament to the fragility of security and the randomness of violence, how a child can leave for school in the morning and never come home, how a brief encounter with the wrong person at the wrong time can end in unthinkable tragedy. And it is a story about the aftermath of murder, about how a single act of violence can claim multiple lives, how grief can kill as surely as any weapon, how a father can die of a broken heart and a mother can be left to carry on alone, forever marked by the worst day of her life. Dabia Benkerd will spend the rest of her life in prison, decades stretching ahead in which she will be removed from society, unable to harm anyone else. But for the Daviet family, for everyone who loved Lola, the sentence provides no closure, no comfort, no restoration of what was taken. Lola remains gone, her future erased, her potential unfulfilled. Johan remains dead, killed by grief 16 months after his daughter. And Delphine continues on, carrying the weight of losing both her daughter and her husband, living in a world that can never be right again, testifying in court and fighting to ensure that Lola is remembered not as a victim or a political symbol, but as the beloved child she was. Story 6. The summer of 2023 was supposed to be a season of celebration for Madison Schemitz, a time when she could enjoy the final months before her senior year at Ponte Vedra High School in Florida, where she was a star softball player with dreams stretching as far as her athletic talent could take her. She was 17 years old, vibrant and ambitious, the kind of young woman who lit up a room with her energy and determination. Her mother, Jacqueline Roge, whom everyone called Jackie, watched her daughter with the pride that only a parent can feel when they see their child flourishing, building friendships, pursuing passions, and preparing to step into the bright future that awaited. But darkness had been gathering on the periphery of Madison's life, a shadow that grew longer and more menacing with each passing day after she made a decision that should have been simple and straightforward. She ended her relationship with her boyfriend, Spencer Pearson. They had dated for approximately 6 months, a relationship that from the outside had seemed like typical teenage romance, two young people navigating the complexities of first love. But when Madison decided in April 2023 that the relationship wasn't working for her, when she exercised her fundamental right to choose who she wanted in her life, Spencer's response revealed something far darker than teenage heartbreak. What followed the breakup was not acceptance or the natural process of moving on, but an escalating campaign of stalking and harassment that would consume the next 2 months of Madison's life and ultimately nearly cost her everything. Spencer created fake social media accounts to monitor Madison's online activity, digital personas designed to slip past the block she had placed on his real accounts. He left notes on her car, cryptic messages that made it clear he was watching her movements, tracking where she went and when. He followed her to school, appearing in places where he knew she would be, making his presence felt in a way that was impossible to ignore. He sent her a photograph of himself attempting suicide with a tie, a manipulative gesture meant to elicit guilt and sympathy, to make her feel responsible for his emotional state. Madison and her mother were not passive in the face of this harassment. They documented the behavior, saved the evidence, and were in the process of obtaining a restraining order against Spencer. They took the threat seriously, even as they tried to maintain some normalcy in Madison's life, allowing her to spend time with friends, to continue her athletic training, to be a teenager despite the fear that was beginning to color every decision. But restraining orders are pieces of paper, legal documents that carry the weight of the court system, but cannot physically protect someone from a determined attacker. And Spencer Pearson, as events would tragically prove, was determined beyond any reasonable measure. On the evening of June 3rd, 2023, Madison went to dinner with her mother and some friends at Mr. Chubby's Wings, a restaurant in Ponte Vedra Beach, a casual spot where young people gathered and families enjoyed meals in the warmth of a Florida summer evening. It should have been an ordinary outing, the kind of evening that fades into pleasant memory, distinguished by good food and laughter and the simple joy of being together. But as Madison and Jackie sat at their table, as they talked with friends and tried to enjoy their meal, Madison spotted someone who made her blood run cold. Spencer Pearson, sitting at a nearby table, watching them. The decision to leave was immediate and unanimous. Madison and her mother excused themselves, gathered their things, and headed toward the exit, hoping to avoid any confrontation, to simply remove themselves from Spencer's presence and get to safety. Surveillance cameras throughout the restaurant captured what happened next, footage that would later be shown in court, a chilling documentation of violence erupting in a public space where people should have been safe. Spencer followed them outside. Madison and Jackie were near their vehicle when he approached from behind, moving with purpose and carrying a knife. There was no warning, no final words or ultimatum, just sudden, explosive violence. Spencer attacked Madison from behind, tackling her to the ground and holding her down as he began stabbing her repeatedly. The knife rose and fell again and again, 17 times in total, each thrust an attempt to end the life of a young woman whose only crime was choosing to end a relationship. Jackie Roge did what any mother would do when she saw her daughter being murdered. She threw herself into the fight, desperately trying to pull Spencer off Madison, to shield her child's body with her own. Spencer turned the knife on her, stabbing her in the forehead, the hand, and the leg, wounds that bled profusely but didn't stop her from continuing to fight for her daughter's life. Inside the restaurant and in the parking lot, people heard the screams and rushed to help. Kennedy Armstrong, a 23-year-old bystander who had been eating at the restaurant, ran toward the violence without hesitation, driven by the moral imperative to help someone in desperate need. He threw himself at Spencer, physically separating him from his victims and holding him down despite being stabbed in the hand during the struggle. Kennedy's intervention saved Madison's life, preventing Spencer from continuing the assault and giving first responders precious minutes to arrive and begin treatment. With witnesses restraining him and his attempted murder interrupted, Spencer took the knife and drew it across his own throat multiple times, telling those around him that he was trying to kill himself. The self-inflicted wounds were severe enough to leave permanent scars, but not fatal. When police arrived, they found a scene of devastating violence. Madison barely clinging to life, her mother wounded and frantic, a good Samaritan bleeding from his hand, and the attacker with a slashed throat lying on the ground. Madison was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The extent of her injuries became clear as doctors worked to save her life. 17 stab wounds had penetrated her body, and the damage to her spinal cord was catastrophic. When Madison finally regained consciousness and began to comprehend what had happened to her, she received news that would have broken most people. She was paralyzed from the chest down. At 17 years old, a star athlete who had built her identity around physical prowess and competition, she faced the reality that she might never walk again. The first time Madison spoke publicly about the attack was on July 7, 2023, at Brooks Rehabilitation Hospital, where she was undergoing intensive therapy. Surrounded by her mother, Kennedy Armstrong, friends, and the medical team working to help her heal, Madison addressed reporters with a strength and grace that belied her age and the trauma she had endured. "Regarding my recovery, I am currently paralyzed from the chest down," she said, her voice steady despite the devastating words. "It will be a long and hard road, but I am determined and confident in myself that I will reach my goals to one day walk again. Thank you all for the support thus far. My story is just getting started." Her gratitude was boundless, directed at everyone who had played a role in saving her life and supporting her recovery. She thanked the first responders who had rushed to the scene, the emergency room doctors and nurses who had worked frantically to stabilize her, the surgeons who had operated to repair the damage, the therapists who pushed her daily to regain function, even the nutritionists who ensured her body had the fuel it needed to heal. She acknowledged her mother with special tenderness. "I want to thank my mom. She is one of my heroes. My love for her is boundless, and I feel incredibly fortunate to be her daughter. And Kennedy Armstrong, the stranger who had become family through his selfless act of heroism, received words that captured what his intervention had meant. I will forever be grateful for his courageous actions. Kennedy is my hero and will always be family. Kennedy, who had been eating dinner when he heard screams and made the split-second decision to run toward danger instead of away from it, had suffered injuries to his hand during the attack, but had never hesitated, never second-guessed his choice to help. The road to recovery that Madison described as long and hard proved to be exactly that, but also something more, a testament to human resilience and determination. At Brooks Rehabilitation, Madison attacked her physical therapy with the same intensity she had once brought to the softball diamond. Her therapists marveled at her work ethic, noting that no matter what they asked of her, no matter how exhausted she became physically or mentally, Madison responded with determination. Sure, let's go, let's do it. The progress came in increments that felt miraculous to everyone watching. First, sensation began returning to parts of her body that had been numb. Then, with assistance, she was able to stand, an achievement that brought tears of joy to everyone in the therapy room. Day by day, session by session, Madison worked toward a goal that many thought was impossible. She wanted to walk across the stage at her high school graduation to receive her diploma. Less than a year after being stabbed 17 times and left paralyzed, Madison Schemitz did exactly that. On her graduation day, wearing her cap and gown, she walked across that stage with the support of her medical team and the cheers of everyone who had followed her journey. It was a moment of triumph that transcended a simple high school milestone, a powerful statement that violence had not defeated her, that determination and support could overcome even the most devastating circumstances. Meanwhile, Spencer Ross Pearson had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of attempted premeditated first-degree murder and aggravated battery with a deadly weapon. His attorneys would argue at sentencing that Spencer suffered from major depressive disorder with psychotic features, social anxiety disorder, and was on the autism spectrum. His family blamed head trauma he had sustained as a high school football player for his actions. A forensic psychologist testified about his diagnoses and mental health struggles. But none of these explanations could erase what he had done, could undo the violence he had inflicted, could restore what he had taken from Madison and the other victims. Spencer ultimately pleaded guilty to the charges, and on November 22, 2024, he appeared in a St. Augustine courtroom for sentencing. The scars on his neck from his suicide attempt were visible, a permanent reminder of the violence that had erupted that June evening. The sentencing guidelines called for 18 years to life, and his defense attorneys argued for a sentence below the guidelines, citing his age, his mental health issues, and his lack of prior criminal history. But Judge Lee R. Smith was unequivocal in his decision. Any deviation below the guidelines is inappropriate. Spencer Ross Pearson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Spencer offered a statement that attempted to explain his actions. "I need serious help, and I have for a long time," he said. But for Madison, her family, and the other victims, the statement rang hollow, words that came too late and offered too little accountability for the devastation he had caused. Following the sentencing, Madison shared her own statement, demonstrating the remarkable poise and forward-thinking perspective that had characterized her entire recovery. "As we move forward from here, we are focused on healing and rebuilding. This chapter, though challenging, is now behind us," she said. "And while it will take time, we are committed to moving forward with hope and strength. For me, the journey is far from over. There are still many steps to take, many challenges ahead, and many lessons to learn. But with the support of those who have stood by me, I'm confident that I will continue to grow stronger each day. What's next is about finding peace, embracing the future, and using the strength I've gained to help others who may face similar struggles." The case of Madison Schemitz stands as a stark illustration of how quickly stalking and harassment can escalate to attempted murder, how restraining orders and awareness of danger are sometimes not enough to prevent violence when someone is determined to harm their victim. It demonstrates the critical importance of bystander intervention, as Kennedy Armstrong's willingness to help likely saved Madison's life. And it showcases the power of human resilience, the ability of the human spirit to not only survive unimaginable trauma, but to transform that suffering into purpose, advocacy, and hope for others. Madison's journey from a brutal attack that left her paralyzed to walking across her graduation stage and becoming a national advocate represents one of the most inspiring recovery stories in recent memory. Her mother's fierce protection, Kennedy Armstrong's selfless heroism, and the dedication of her medical team all played crucial roles in her survival and recovery. But ultimately, it was Madison's own determination, her refusal to let violence define her future, that has allowed her not just to survive but to thrive. Spencer Pearson will spend the rest of his life in prison, his youth and future forfeited because he chose violence over acceptance, murder over moving on. Madison Skemetz, meanwhile, continues to recover, to advocate, to inspire, and to build a life defined not by what was done to her, but by how she chose to respond to it. Her story is indeed just getting started, and the chapters that follow will be written by her own hand, shaped by her own choices, guided by the strength she has demonstrated every single day since that terrible June evening when violence sought to silence her voice forever. Story 7. The summer sun hung bright over the island of Kos, casting golden light across the Aegean Sea and warming the cobblestone streets where tourists wandered with ice cream cones and sun-kissed shoulders. It was a paradise, this Greek island where ancient ruins met modern beach resorts, where the air smelled of salt and jasmine, and where dreams of adventure seemed to materialize with every sunset. For Anastasia Patricia Rubinska, a 27-year-old woman from Wrocław, Poland, Kos had become more than just a vacation destination. It was home, at least for the season. She had come to work in a hotel restaurant, embracing the opportunity to live by the sea, to meet people from around the world, and to save money while experiencing life in a place far different from the industrial landscapes of southwestern Poland. Anastasia, known to her friends and family as a vibrant and independent spirit, had built a life on the island. She shared her days with her boyfriend, another seasonal worker who had been drawn to Kos by the same promise of sun-drenched days and the thrill of living somewhere beautiful and temporary. Together, they navigated the rhythms of island life. Early morning shifts at the hotel, afternoons spent on the beach, and evenings mingling with the eclectic community of locals and expatriates who called Kos their temporary or permanent home. It was a simple existence, perhaps, but it was theirs, and for Anastasia, it seemed to offer the freedom and possibility she had been seeking. The evening of June 12, 2023, began like any other. Anastasia had finished her shift at the hotel and decided to go out for the night, seeking the companionship and energy that came with socializing after a long day of work. She told her boyfriend she would be back later, and he thought nothing of it. Anastasia was capable, confident, and knew the island well. The bars and cafes of Kos were familiar territory, places where she had spent countless evenings laughing with friends and enjoying the relaxed atmosphere of island nightlife. But as the hours passed and the night deepened into morning, Anastasia did not return. When the first light of dawn broke over the horizon and Anastasia still had not come home, her boyfriend's concern turned to alarm. He contacted the local Greek authorities, reporting her missing and providing them with the details of the previous evening. The police launched an investigation immediately, knowing that time was critical in cases of disappearance. They began by retracing Anastasia's steps, speaking to witnesses, and reviewing surveillance footage from the bars and streets she had visited that night. What they discovered was both illuminating and deeply troubling. The footage revealed that Anastasia had spent the evening at a bar, where she had been seen in the company of a group of 5 men, all of whom were South Asian workers living on the island. Among them was a 32-year-old man from Bangladesh named Salahuddin, who had been residing legally in Greece for 11 years and had no prior criminal record. According to witnesses and the surveillance recordings, Anastasia appeared to be socializing with the group, and at some point during the night, she was seen leaving the bar with Salahuddin. The last image captured on camera showed her riding on the back of his scooter, heading in the direction of his residence. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. The police quickly identified Salahuddin as a person of interest and began investigating his background and movements. They learned that he worked on the island and lived in a modest dwelling not far from the area where Anastasia had last been seen. Officers arrived at his home to question him, and what they found during their initial search raised immediate red flags. Inside the residence, investigators discovered a shirt stained with blood and containing strands of blonde hair that would later be confirmed through DNA analysis to belong to Anastasia. The man himself bore visible signs of a struggle. His face and hands were covered in scratches, and there were marks on his hands consistent with a violent altercation. When confronted with this evidence, Salahuddin initially admitted to having had a sexual encounter with Anastasia, though he later changed his story and denied any wrongdoing. The police detained Salahuddin for further questioning, but Anastasia's whereabouts remained unknown. As the investigation intensified, a search party combed the island, focusing on areas near the suspect's residence. The landscape of Kos, while beautiful, presented challenges. There were salt marshes, dense vegetation, and remote stretches of coastline where something or someone could easily be hidden. For 6 agonizing days, the search continued, with investigators following every lead and analyzing every piece of evidence they could find. On June 18, 2023, the search came to a heartbreaking conclusion. In a salt marsh near the Tagaki Beach area, approximately 1 kilometer from Salahuddin's residence, authorities discovered a plastic bin bag covered with branches and a bed sheet. Inside, wrapped and discarded like refuse, was the body of Anastasia Patricia Rubinska. She was naked, and the condition of her remains told a story of unimaginable violence and suffering. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community of Kos and reverberated across international borders, reaching Poland, where Anastasia's family and friends awaited news with dwindling hope. The autopsy report confirmed the worst fears. Anastasia had died from asphyxiation, specifically from strangulation, and there were signs that she had been subjected to torture before her death. The forensic examination also indicated that she had been physically assaulted. The brutality of the crime was difficult to comprehend, and as the details emerged, public outrage grew. The image of a young woman, full of life and potential, being subjected to such horror was unbearable for those who had known her, and for the countless others who followed the case through the media. Investigators continued to build their case against Salahuddin, piecing together the timeline of events and gathering physical evidence. In addition to the blood-stained shirt and DNA evidence found in his home, police discovered that Salahuddin had attempted to cover his tracks in the days following Anastasia's disappearance. He had purchased a plane ticket to Italy and was planning to flee the island. More disturbingly, forensic analysis of his electronic devices revealed a series of incriminating internet searches. In the hours and days after Anastasia's death, Salahuddin had searched for phrases such as how to hide a body, how to erase fingerprints, and ways to mislead investigators. These searches painted a chilling picture of a man who knew exactly what he had done and was desperately trying to evade justice. Anastasia's mobile phone was also recovered during the investigation, though it had been tampered with in an attempt to destroy evidence. The SIM card had been removed, GPS services were disabled, and all data on the phone, including call history, messages, and photographs, had been wiped clean. The deliberate destruction of this evidence suggested premeditation and a calculated effort to eliminate any trail that might lead back to the perpetrator. On June 22, 2023, Salahuddin was formally charged with the kidnapping and murder of Anastasia Patricia Rubinska. The charge of kidnapping was based on evidence suggesting that Anastasia had been taken to Salahuddin's residence against her will or under false pretenses, where she was then subjected to the brutal attack that ended her life. Throughout the legal proceedings, Salahuddin maintained his innocence, pleading not guilty to all charges. His defense attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, but the weight of the physical evidence, forensic analysis, and digital records was overwhelming. The case quickly became a cause célèbre, attracting significant attention both in Greece and internationally. In Poland, the news of Anastasia's death sparked a wave of grief and anger. Prime Minister publicly expressed his shock and outrage, calling the murder brutal and demanding that Greece extradite the suspect to Poland so that he could be tried in a Polish court and receive what the Prime Minister described as the highest possible sentence. The request, while understandable from an emotional and political standpoint, was complicated by legal realities. European Union law did not provide a clear mechanism for transferring the prosecution to another member state, especially given that the crime had been committed in Greece and was being investigated by Greek authorities. Extradition was deemed unlikely, if not impossible, and the trial would proceed in Greece. The case also became entangled in broader political debates about migration and border security, particularly in Poland, where the ruling government had taken a hard stance on immigration. Some politicians and commentators seized on Anastasia's death as evidence of the dangers posed by migrants and refugees, despite the fact that Salahuddin had been a legal resident of Greece for over a decade and had no prior criminal history. The rhetoric grew heated, with some public figures making inflammatory statements that attributed the actions of one individual to entire communities of migrants. This politicization of the tragedy drew criticism from those who argued that it disrespected Anastasia's memory and fueled xenophobia, rather than addressing the real issues of violence against women and the need for justice. Adding to the pain experienced by Anastasia's family and friends was the spread of misinformation and victim-blaming commentary on social media and in certain media outlets. As details of the case became public, some individuals questioned Anastasia's behavior on the night of her disappearance, suggesting that she bore responsibility for what happened to her. Comments ranged from judgmental remarks about her decision to socialize and drink alcohol to outright assertions that she had been asking for it, or that her death was a form of divine punishment. Such statements were not only deeply hurtful, but also reflected harmful attitudes that place blame on victims of violence rather than on the perpetrators. Journalists and advocates working to combat violence against women condemned these narratives, emphasizing that no one deserves to be harmed, regardless of their choices or actions. As the investigation continued, authorities explored the possibility that others might have been involved in Anastasia's kidnapping and death. The initial reports indicated that she had been with a group of 5 men on the night she disappeared, raising questions about whether any of them had participated in or witnessed the crime. However, as the evidence was analyzed and witnesses were interviewed, it became clear that Salahuddin was the primary suspect, and no charges were brought against the other individuals. The trial of Salahuddin S. began on December 2, 2024, more than a year after Anastasia's death. The proceedings took place in a Greek court, where prosecutors presented a comprehensive case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and digital records. The prosecution argued that Salahuddin had lured Anastasia to his home, where he subjected her to kidnapping, physical assault, and ultimately murder. The physical evidence, the DNA, the scratches, the internet searches, and the deliberate disposal of her body, all pointed to a premeditated and heinous act. Salahuddin's defense continued to assert his innocence, but the evidence presented by the prosecution was damning. The lead investigator, David Berzaki, testified about the findings, including the incriminating Google searches and the plane ticket Salahuddin had purchased in an apparent attempt to flee. The court also heard from forensic experts who detailed the injuries Anastasia had sustained and the manner in which she had died. On December 6, 2024, the court delivered its verdict. Salahuddin was found guilty of kidnapping and manslaughter with intent, a charge that acknowledged the deliberate nature of his actions and the brutality of the crime. He was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that reflected the gravity of what he had done. Outside the courthouse, Anastasia's father, Andrei, spoke to the press, his voice heavy with grief. "This punishment will not bring Anastasia back," he said. expressing the profound and irreversible loss that no legal sentence could ever undo. The conclusion of the trial brought a measure of closure, but it could not erase the pain or answer the deeper questions that lingered in the hearts of those who loved Anastasia. What had driven a seemingly ordinary man to commit such an act of violence? What could have been done to prevent it? And how could society better protect women from the pervasive threat of gender-based violence that persists in every corner of the world? Anastasia Patricia Rybinska's story is a tragic reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can exist even in the most beautiful places. She had come to coast seeking adventure, independence, and the simple joy of living in a place where the sea met the sky. Instead, she became the victim of a senseless and brutal crime that ended her life far too soon. Her memory lives on in the hearts of her family, her friends, and all those who have been touched by her story. And while justice was served in the form of a life sentence for her killer, the true measure of justice would be a world where no woman has to fear for her safety, where violence is not tolerated, and where every life is valued and protected. Story 8. The sprawling estate in Clover, South Carolina, stood as a monument to American ambition and success, its white columns and red brick facade deliberately modeled after Mount Vernon, the historic home of George Washington. The mansion sat on expansive grounds worth close to $800,000, nestled in a quiet corner of York County, where privacy was guaranteed and neighbors were scarce. Inside, 64-year-old Stephen Delval Clayton had built a life that many would envy. He was a retired entrepreneur who had founded and run a successful medical transcription company before selling it and retiring in 1995. His financial acumen had earned him a fortune exceeding $1 million in assets, not including the magnificent home he shared with his wife of 5 years. To those who knew him, Steve Clayton was a visionary, a brilliant strategist, and a man who had worked hard for everything he achieved. But in July 2018, in the final days of his life, Steve Clayton would become the victim of one of the most bizarre and disturbing murder methods investigators had ever encountered. Lana Sue Clayton, Steve's 52-year-old wife, presented herself as a devoted partner and a dedicated healthcare professional. She worked as a nurse at a Veterans Affairs hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina, commuting to work each day from their South Carolina mansion. To the outside world, the Claytons appeared to be living an idyllic retirement, a couple who had found each other later in life and were enjoying the fruits of Steve's decades of hard work. Lana attended the neighborhood study group, participated in community activities, and maintained an active presence on social media, where she portrayed a life of domestic contentment. The couple had been together for 8 years, married for 5, and on the surface, everything seemed perfectly normal. But behind the imposing facade of their Mount Vernon replica home, something dark was unfolding in the days leading up to July 21st, 2018. She had been systematically poisoning her husband with tetrahydrozoline, the active ingredient found in common over-the-counter eye drop medications like Visine. The substance, designed to constrict blood vessels in the eyes and reduce redness, becomes deadly when ingested in sufficient quantities. Medical literature warns that even a few drops can cause serious adverse events including nausea, difficulty breathing, elevated then dangerously lowered blood pressure, seizures, and coma. In large amounts, it can stop the heart. Starting on July 19, 2018, Lana began adding drops of the eye medication to Steve's drinking water. She would later claim that she only intended to make him uncomfortable, to teach him a lesson, though prosecutors would vehemently dispute this characterization. Day after day, she continued the poisoning, watching as her husband grew increasingly ill. Steve, who had been active and healthy, suddenly found himself bedridden, suffering from what he believed was a severe bout of vertigo. The room spun around him, his body betrayed him, and he could not understand what was happening. Lana, the trained nurse who should have been caring for him, who had taken an oath to do no harm, instead watched him deteriorate while continuing to administer the poison. On the morning of July 21st, 2018, the poisoning reached its inevitable conclusion. Steve Clayton was found dead at the bottom of the staircase in their home. When first responders arrived at the mansion, summoned by Lana's call, they encountered a widow who appeared distraught, who explained that her husband had been suffering from severe vertigo for 3 days, and who suggested he must have fallen down the stairs while trying to move around the house. The scene appeared consistent with an accidental death, a tragic case of an older man losing his balance and suffering fatal injuries in a fall. The deputy coroner who arrived at the Clayton mansion shortly after Steve's death conducted a preliminary examination and found nothing suspicious. Lana was cooperative, answering questions and providing information about Steve's recent health issues. She made no mention of attempting to revive him, and investigators noted that Steve's cell phone, which he always kept with him, was nowhere to be found. The coroner's office initially ruled that Steve had most likely died of a heart attack, possibly triggered by the fall or the underlying vertigo condition. It seemed like a straightforward case of natural causes, the kind of death that happens to older adults with some regularity. Steve's body was prepared for release to the family. But within hours of Steve's death, something struck his family members as profoundly wrong. Steve's nephew Nick French was at the house when Lana suddenly announced her plans for Steve's remains. She looked up from her hands and declared that they should take Steve to the funeral home right down the street and have him cremated immediately. The speed with which she made this decision, the firmness of her tone, and the lack of consultation with Steve's extended family raised alarm bells. When Steve's nephew Chris asked Lana for Steve's will so they could check his burial wishes, he was taken aback by her response. Lana claimed there was no will. Chris knew this could not be true. His uncle had made him the executor of the estate and had told him about the will's provisions. When Chris pressed the issue, Lana stood up, looked him in the eye, and stated emphatically that there was no will. The interaction left Chris deeply uncomfortable. Something about Lana's demeanor, about her insistence on immediate cremation, about her denial of the will's existence, felt wrong. Chris and Nick made a decision that would ultimately crack the case wide open. Without telling Lana, they called the coroner's office and demanded an autopsy and a full toxicology screening. Coroner Sabrina Gast, perhaps sensing something in their urgency, agreed to their request. The decision to perform an autopsy over Lana's objections would prove to be the crucial turning point in what would become a homicide investigation. The toxicology results came back several weeks later, and what they revealed was stunning. Steve Clayton's blood contained an abnormally high concentration of tetrahydrozoline, the chemical compound found in eye drop medications. The levels were not consistent with accidental exposure, or even with someone who had used eye drops normally, and somehow ingested a small amount. The concentration in Steve's system was consistent with deliberate and repeated dosing over multiple days. The finding immediately transformed the investigation from a routine death inquiry into a potential homicide. Coroner Sabrina Gast called Lana Clayton in for an interview. When Lana arrived, she presented herself as confident and composed, a woman who had nothing to hide. What Lana did not know was that investigators from the York County Sheriff's Office and the FBI were in an adjacent room, listening to every word through monitoring equipment. As the interview progressed, Lana's story began to evolve. Initially, she maintained that Steve had simply died of natural causes, that his 3-day illness and subsequent fall had been a tragic accident. But as Gast pressed her about the toxicology findings, Lana's narrative shifted. Lana introduced a new element to her story, allegations of abuse. She claimed that Steve had been verbally and physically abusive throughout their marriage, that he had hit her several times, that she had lived in fear of him. She portrayed herself as a victim who had been trapped in an abusive relationship with a wealthy, controlling husband. The allegations were serious and would become central to her eventual defense strategy. But when investigators looked for evidence to corroborate her claims, they found none. There were no police reports, no hospital records, no documentation of any kind that supported the idea that Steve Clayton had been violent toward his wife. Those who knew Steve were shocked and offended by the accusations. His sister, Rosie Clayton Leslie, told investigators that the man Lana described was unrecognizable. "The way she portrayed him, I don't know that person. Nobody that knows Steve knows that person," she said. Steve's friends and extended family described him as gentle and generous, someone who had built a successful business through intelligence and hard work, not through intimidation or cruelty. To them, Lana's abuse allegations seemed like a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. As the investigation continued, more damning evidence emerged. Investigators discovered that Lana had been researching the effects of tetrahydrozoline poisoning before Steve's death, suggesting premeditation. They learned that Steve's cell phone, which had been missing from the death scene, had been thrown into a lake by Lana, ensuring that Steve could not call for help even if he had realized what was happening to him. Most damningly, they discovered that Steve's will had not merely been misplaced, but had been destroyed by Lana shortly after his death. The will would have dictated how Steve's considerable estate would be distributed, and by destroying it, Lana positioned herself to inherit everything under South Carolina's intestacy laws. On August 31st, 2018, more than a month after Steve's death, Lana Clayton was formally arrested and charged with murder and unlawful malicious tampering with food. The arrest made headlines across South Carolina and beyond, as news outlets seized on the bizarre nature of the crime. A nurse had poisoned her husband with eye drops, allowing him to suffer for 3 days before he finally succumbed to the toxic effects of a substance found in millions of American medicine cabinets. The case seemed almost too strange to be real. During the investigation, Lana attempted suicide, another complication in an already complex case. Her defense attorneys would later cite this suicide attempt as evidence of her mental distress, and as support for their argument that she had been a deeply traumatized woman pushed to the breaking point by years of abuse. They painted a picture of Lana as a good person who had dedicated her life to caring for veterans, who had herself been a victim of childhood sexual abuse and rape on a military base, and who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. According to the defense, Lana had acted impulsively, not with premeditation, and had not intended to kill Steve, but only to make him sick enough that he would understand how she felt. But prosecutors saw a very different story in the evidence. Solicitor Kevin Brackett argued that Lana had killed Steve for money, that she had deliberately poisoned him over 3 days, that she had destroyed his will to ensure she would inherit his fortune, and that she had disposed of his phone to prevent him from calling for help. The prosecutors characterized Lana as calculating and cold-blooded, someone who had watched her husband suffer and die while doing nothing to help him. "How can you maintain you did this to teach him a lesson, when it is obvious from the facts that you let him suffer for 3 days?" they would later ask. The case proceeded toward trial, with both sides preparing their arguments and evidence. But before the trial could begin, Lana's attorneys negotiated a plea agreement with prosecutors. On January 16, 2020, Lana Sue Clayton appeared in a York County courtroom and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and tampering with food or drugs. By accepting the plea deal, she avoided a potential first-degree murder conviction that could have resulted in a life sentence without parole. Under the terms of the agreement, she faced up to 30 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter. The sentencing hearing was an emotional proceeding that laid bare the depth of pain Steve Clayton's family had endured. His goddaughter, Lourdes Alvarez, stood before the judge with tears streaming down her face and urged the court to punish Lana to the fullest extent of the law. "Lana has fooled a lot of people. Please don't let her fool you," she implored. Steve's sister called Lana a monster, someone who had coldly calculated her husband's death and nearly gotten away with it. The family reminded the judge that without their intervention in demanding an autopsy, Steve's death would have been ruled natural causes and Lana would have walked away a wealthy widow. Lana addressed the court, offering a tearful statement in which she claimed that she had never intended to kill Steve. "I did impulsively put the Visine in Steven's drink, but I just did it to make him uncomfortable," she told the judge. "I never thought it would kill him." Her voice broke as she described the remorse she felt, the horror of realizing what she had done. But her words rang hollow to Steve's family, who had watched her lie repeatedly throughout the investigation, and who knew that she had continued poisoning Steve for 3 full days, never calling for medical help, never showing mercy. Judge Paul M. Birch, who presided over the sentencing, made clear his view of the case. He told the court that in his years on the bench, he had never encountered anything quite like the Clayton case. "This one takes the cake as far as being bizarre," he stated. He quoted the famous line about tangled webs and deception, telling Lana, "What a tangled web we weave. Miss Clayton, you certainly have tangled this one up." The judge noted that Lana had let Steve suffer for 3 days, had watched him deteriorate, and had done nothing to help him. On January 16, 2020, Judge Birch sentenced Lana Sue Clayton to 25 years in prison. For Steve Clayton's family, the conviction and sentencing brought some measure of closure, but could never truly heal the wound of his loss. They had lost a brother, an uncle, a friend, someone who had worked his entire life to build something meaningful, and who should have been enjoying his retirement years. Instead, he had died in agony, betrayed by the woman he had married, his final days marked by confusion and suffering as the poison worked through his system. His sister noted that Lana had nearly succeeded in her deception, that without the family's insistence on an autopsy, Steve's death would have been recorded as natural and Lana would have inherited his fortune without ever facing justice. The mansion in Clover, once a symbol of Steve's success and the life he had built, became instead a crime scene and then a property to be disposed of in settling his estate. The Mount Vernon replica that Steve had been so proud of would forever be associated with the terrible events of July 2018, with the 3 days of deliberate poisoning that ended in death. For the community of Clover, a small town where such crimes were virtually unheard of, the case served as a disturbing reminder that evil could exist behind even the most impressive facades, that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. Lana Clayton is currently serving her 25-year sentence in a South Carolina correctional facility. She will be eligible for parole in approximately 2035, when she will be in her 60s. Whether she will express genuine remorse for her actions, whether she will ever fully acknowledge the calculated nature of her crime, remains to be seen. For now, she remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming we know what happens behind closed doors, about the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil, and about how a substance as innocuous as eye drops can become an instrument of murder when wielded by someone determined to kill. Steve Clayton was 64 years old when he died, with potentially decades of life still ahead of him. He should have been traveling, enjoying his grandchildren, pursuing hobbies, and reaping the rewards of his successful career. Instead, his life was cut short by the person who had promised to love and honor him, who had stood beside him as his wife, who had betrayed that trust in the most intimate and terrible way imaginable. His story stands as a reminder that vulnerability exists not only on dark streets or in dangerous situations, but sometimes in our own homes, with the people we trust most.